Hello, BookTube. I'm here with another video about science fiction and I guess you could say adventure, trying to combine a few things, but mostly science fiction. And it's to talk about what is arguably the first UK science fiction magazine. Now, I say arguably, which I will come back to later. But as everybody is aware, that the first dedicated science fiction magazine was published by Hugo Gernsback with Amazing Stories, and its first issue came out in April 1926. But that was in the U.S. It's not to say that there wasn't science fiction being written before that, but this was the first dedicated magazine solely to science fiction that had a home. And those magazines and science fiction was gaining popularity even in the UK, but those very early pulps were a bit scarce in the UK. And they did have science fiction that was running throughout other magazines at the time. Pearson's magazine, which we'll come back to in a moment. But there was another publisher called Odins Press. Now, many might be familiar with Odins Press with their companion book club that was out during the 60s and other collections of classic literature. But they also published a lot of magazines. And they had a long-running magazine called The Passing Show. And in the early 30s, it was converted, I think it was from a monthly to a weekly. But in either case, during this time, it was a weekly. And they started serializing, they touted it as a family magazine. But they started serializing Edgar Rice Burroughs' Venus stories. And they became popular. And C. Arthur Pearson Limited, of Pearson Magazine fame, took notice of this. And they had published a lot of this kind of material, as I say, in Pearson's magazine. They published H.G. Wells, George Griffiths, it's a number of them. But the overall editor of the magazines at the time was Hayden Dimick, and he took up the reins for this new weekly newspaper / magazine called Scoops. And it wasn't touted right at the beginning as science fiction, but that was its aim, and to publish that material. But it was aimed at young people, boys. Now, in the first, I'm going to read part of the editorial of the first issue. It says here, to a newspaper man, everything that is different, out of the ordinary, something others haven't got, is a scoop. Here, then, is a paper full of good stories, all scoops. There are scoops because they are different, because they look ahead with the vision of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, whose fiction stories of wonder and science declared impossibilities at the time of publication are now fact. Scoops is a paper for all. It has the thrill of adventure and mystery and will transport its readers from the everyday happenings into the future, with all its exceptions of development and discovery. As a story paper, Scoop stands in a class of its own. It arrives at a time when all the world is wondering what the next new and amazing discovery will be. In its stories, Scoops will endeavor to anticipate the marvels of the age in which we live. Thus will it justify its claim as the story paper of tomorrow. So began the first issue that was issued, the first issue that was published in February 1934. February 10th, it came out for sale. It was dated, but it came out for sale on February 8th, to be precise. Now, as I say, Hayden Dimick was the editor, and he touted he solicited for authors who wrote boy stories. Now, in the first number of issues, they serialized because it was weekly. It was about 28 pages long, the paper at 2p each. Now, as I say, he solicited boy story authors. And at the first number of issues, the authors were anonymous. But a number of them have been identified. For instance, uh, the story that was serialized, Master of the Moon, was by Bernard Bully, and he was the editor of a short-lived magazine called Boys Magazine. Another one, The Standing Terror, was by Reginald Thomas. Now, he was a prolific boy story writer with several thousand to his credit. Now, this continued for a number of issues. Around the 12th issue, so 12 weeks in, the editor, Dimick, started finding out, well, hey, science fiction is just not for boys as well. Adults are getting into this, and there was a lot of talk about this new paper, and it had a huge distribution, or at least I think it's quite huge. It had a print run over 100,000 copies, and as I say, at 2 pence each. Now, he began to publish the stories with authors' names, and one of the first ones he did that because he wanted to, I think, lend some legitimacy and panache to the magazine, and that was a story called Space. That was written by Professor A.M. Lowe. He was a well-known scientist of the time and credited with the inventor of the first guided missile in 1917. And Space was serialized over 10 issues of the magazine. And then, as I say, it carried his byline with it, the name of it. And then later in 1937, it was published as a novel called Adrift in the Stratosphere in 1937. But by the time it got to the 12th issue, that was when Dimick and the editorial staff started finding out that, yeah, this science fiction thing can work, and adults are reading this and paying attention. So he began to give the bylines to the authors, but for the most part, it was still the boys' story authors that held, the majority of the pages in the magazine. But he also began to reprint, and the big reprint was Arthur Conan Doyle from a novel that was actually originally published in the Strand magazine in 1913. It was serialized then, so he re-serialized it, and it was The Poison Belt. And here is issue number 15 and 16 with The Poison Belt in. So this is from 1934, and you can see it's it's called the tabloid size. It was stapled, and as I say, it was about 28 pages, but on newsprint. And some of the covers had color ink on them as well. And there's number 16 with another part to, as you can see, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Poison Belt. By this time, though, the sales were starting to drop. Some people liked the way it was before, but it just didn't have the oomph, and I think the quality of the stories were lacking as well, because he still held on to having the majority being by boy story writers, which didn't quite understand science fiction. However, other science fiction authors began to appear in the last issues, like John Russell Fearn, who was had a massive impact on British science fiction, and also at this time as well. Now, it went defunct after 20 issues. And that was dated, the last issue was dated June 23rd, 1934. So not too long, because this is issue 15 and 16 that I have here. Now, and I kept saying that it was, arguably the first dedicated full science fiction magazine in the UK. Well, because it's a boys, it was a juvenile or young adult, if you want to say that, magazine. It's kind of hard to say it's really science fiction, because there was the boy story authors that held sway for the majority of the print of the text, the stories. But you know, it showed though that there was an interest, definitely, and it was dedicated to this kind of material. So yes, I think it can arguably said to be the first UK dedicated science fiction magazine. But it was a few years later, in 1937, that the undisputed, I suppose, that nobody questions, the first science fiction magazine came out, adult science fiction magazine. It was called Tales of Wonder, and the first issue was June 1937, under the editorship of Walter Gillings, who was a fan of science fiction, but also became a publisher and an editor of various magazines. But Tales of Wonder definitely was the more traditional looking pulp magazine of the era. But Scoops, even so, I think does hold sway as the first. I'm just looking at that's issue number 15, and that's issue number 16. So these are really they're quite rare because, as you can expect, newspaper print from the 30s doesn't last that well. But these are in pretty good shape. I would love to have a complete set of this, but that's not possible. I've got 2 out of 20, so I think that's pretty darn good. So I hope you enjoyed that. Maybe it's something that you weren't aware of. If anybody is aware of the Scoops magazine and has issues of it, I'd love to hear from you and see what you think of the stories that were written there. Even though, as I say, they were for boys, boy stories. Thank you, BookTube. I'll see you next time.